Hello, my most beloved and murderous horde, and welcome back. I am your mistress of murder, and you all by now know my son Charlie. Say hello, Charlie. This video has been long since overdue. In fact, it probably should have been one of the first videos I ever made for this channel, but better late than never. In this video, I'll be going over some common terms that I've used in videos in the past, and just going over some definitions that are in the United States court system that not everyone may be familiar with, and debunking some common misconceptions when concerning the topic of true crime and how the United States judicial system actually works. It may not be as interesting as my other videos, but I hope you all enjoyed anyway. So, shall we begin? You know the drill by now, my lovelies. Pick your poison. Sit back, relax, and let us have ourselves a little conversation. What is or are serial killers, multiple murderers, mass murderers, and spree killers, and how do they differ? Well, a multiple murderer is someone who has killed more than one victim. This is not so much a category as it is an umbrella term. Now, multiple murder is then separated into three different categories, that being mass murderer, spree killer, or serial killer. Now, which category a murderer or murderers fall under is based on the patterns of the murders, how many there were, number of locations that they happened at, the killer's actions before, during, and after the murders, length of time between them, and just several other factors that are then used to calculate which of these three categories a particular killer slots into. The first main category is a mass murderer. Now, a mass murderer kills 4 or more people at one location during one continuous period of time. This can happen a period of a few minutes, or it can happen over the span of a few days. Mass murders can be committed by a single individual or by a group of people. A very good example of this would actually be the Columbine school shooters or similar individuals, as they would fall into the category of a mass murderer. The second main category is that of a spree killer. Now, a spree killer is someone who murders 2 or more victims, but at more than one location. Now, although their murders occur in separate locations, their spree is still considered to be a singular event. That's because there's no cooling off period or notable span of time between the murders. Differentiating between mass murderers, spree killers, and serial killers is the source for a lot of ongoing debates among criminologists. But while many experts do agree with the general description of a spree killer, the term is actually often dropped, and mass or serial murderer is used in its place. I would, however, like to note that the term serial murderer is not at all the same or even similar to the term serial killer, though they may sound similar. I actually don't like the term serial murderer because it can get a tad confusing for those who aren't at least mildly familiar with the terminologies that are used in this topic. The third and final main category for killers and murderers is actually serial killer, a topic that my channel almost exclusively covers. A serial killer is someone who murders 3 or more victims, but each victim is killed on a separate occasion. Now, unlike mass murderers and spree killers, a serial killer usually selects their victims, they have cooling off periods between murders, and plan their crimes very carefully. Some serial killers may travel very widely to find their victims or dispose of them, like Ted Bundy did, or they might not and stay in the same general geographical area as their victims. A good example of this would be Jack the Ripper. Now, the term serial killer can also be broken down into even more terms, or in this case, subtypes. These subtypes are pretty important as they say a lot about the mentality, motives, and possible patterns that a killer may have. Finding which subtype a killer fits into can really help law enforcement not only discover, track down, but also capture the killer before they can take any more lives. Now, serial killers often demonstrate very specific patterns that can be identified by police investigators and those who are trained to track these individuals down. Now, what motivates each individual serial killer often remains a mystery. However, their behavior more often than not fits into specific subtypes. In 1988, Ronald Holmes, a criminologist in the University of Louisville, who actually specializes in the study of serial killers, identified 4 types of serial killers. Those types being the visionary, the mission-orientated, the hedonistic, and the power-orientated. The first one, of course, is the visionary. Now, the visionary serial killer is usually psychotic. The visionary is compelled to murder because they hear voices or see visions that are ordering them to kill certain kinds of people. A good example of the visionary type serial killer would be David Berkowitz, aka the Son of Sam, or the .44 caliber killer. The second subtype would be the mission-orientated. Now, the mission-orientated is a serial killer who targets a very specific group of people who they, being the killer, believe are unworthy to live and without whom the world would be a better place. An example of this would be Joseph P. Franklin, aka the racist killer, as he was a legitimate white supremacist. If you're unfamiliar with his case, another example would be the fictional Dr. Hannibal Lecter, as he could possibly also fit into this subtype. The third subtype is what most people actually think of when they think of the term serial killer, and that is the hedonistic serial killer. This is also possibly the most terrifying of the 4, and is most often used in slasher films and horror films. That's because the hedonistic killer is the one that kills for the very thrill of it. It's because they enjoy the act of killing, and sometimes even become sexually aroused during the act of murder. These serial killers are extremely sadistic by nature. You may also hear this subtype being referred to as thrill killers or something similar. A good example of the hedonistic subtype would be the Zodiac killer. The final subtype would be the power-orientated. Now, this is actually the most common type of serial killer, and these killers' hallmark is their need to exert ultimate control over their victims. These murderers are actually not psychotic, but they are obsessed with capturing and controlling their victim and forcing them to obey their every command. There are actually a lot of examples of this particular type of serial killer. As I said, they are the most common. A good example of it, or at least in my opinion, the hallmark of this particular subtype would be Dennis Rader, aka the BTK, or bind, torture, kill. Another good example would be John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and possibly even Ted Bundy. However, Ted Bundy may also fall under the hedonistic subtype as well. What does MO mean? MO is an abbreviation that stands for the Latin term modus operandi, and that's a term that roughly means method of operation. This refers to how a crime is committed and basically just what happened in this crime in general. What does it mean to be legally insane? This is actually a lot harder to define than one would expect. The definition of insanity is actually a legal determination and not a psychological one, as most people would think. However, a psychological analysis does play into it. Now, at times a person may be considered psychotic or mentally unsound by a medical professional, but still not meet the legal definition of being insane, as was the case for John Wayne Gacy and for Jeffrey Dahmer. The legal definition of insanity is so hard to pin down because it varies by jurisdiction. Different states use different standards to determine if a person is legally insane or not. What is the insanity defense? The insanity defense is one of the most controversial and misunderstood defenses in the United States court system. Additionally, it also has one of the lowest success rates among all criminal defenses. And by lowest, I mean out of the 1% of criminal cases that it's actually used in, this defense is successful less than 25% of that 1% of the time. Now, knowing about the insanity defense and when this defense may apply has potential to help a criminal defendant who may be able to assert this defense, but it is absolutely not a guarantee. In fact, in most cases, for lawyers who represent the criminal defendant, they won't use it for defense unless they have literally no other option, and they even strongly discourage their clients from doing so. You see, when the insanity defense is used by a criminal defendant, the most common variation of it is cognitive insanity. Now, under the test for cognitive insanity, a defendant must have A, been so impaired by a mental disease or defect at the time of the act that he or she did not know the nature or quality of the act, or B, if a defendant did know the nature or quality of the act, he or she did not know that the act was wrong. Now, the vast majority of states do allow criminal defendants to invoke the cognitive insanity defense. However, 4 states do not, those states being Kansas, Montana, Idaho, and Utah. While a mentally ill individual will often have diminished culpability with the insanity plea, it's actually very rarely successful in reducing the individual's liability. You see, in order for the insanity plea to be effective, an individual must be declared legally insane by a doctor. This requires an extensive medical examination and, in most cases, an extended stay in a psychiatric hospital to be observed and more or less tested. You see, believe it or not, faking a mental illness or faking insanity when faced with a actual professional, let alone a court-appointed professional in this field, is actually incredibly difficult to do, as normally these court-appointed officials are very good at their job. And even if you are successful in doing so, on average, those who plead insanity successfully end up spending a lot more time in a psychiatric hospital with much stricter rules and in worse conditions than they would have experienced in a prison. The insanity plea is often very misunderstood as well, because a lot of people tend to think it's akin to a non-guilty or not guilty plea, or they see it as some kind of cop-out or as a way to dismiss a case against a defendant. That's actually really not true. See, the insanity plea is a type of affirmative defense. That means when this plea is used, the defendant is not denying that he or she committed the criminal offense in question. In actuality, he or she is admitting that he or she was responsible for the crime. However, the insanity plea suggests that due to an individual's mental state, he or she was not able to rationalize or control their behavior or consider the consequences when the offense was committed. Now, if a defendant is not able to recognize the difference between wrong and right, or legal, illegal, etc., then he or she cannot be held liable for the crime in the United States court system. And in the United States, the insanity plea is actually not used to prove a defendant's innocence as many people think. It's not even used to dismiss his or her case, as I said. Instead, it's actually used to reduce the severity of the conviction and sentence acquired by the defendant. What is temporary insanity? Pleading temporary insanity in a courtroom is one of the other possible defenses that a criminal defendant may raise. This actually requires evidence showing that the prosecution is incorrect or unable to prove that the defending client was not insane in the moment that the crime was committed. Through providing details or a lack of memories in the situation, it may be possible to prove temporary insanity was in effect. Now, these situations include, but aren't necessarily limited to, brief moments where the individual committed a crime without knowing what he or she was doing due to a mental disorder that affects them intermittently, being mentally impaired by drugs or alcohol, mental stability not being a factor due to the crime being in the heat of the moment, or a crime of passion as it's sometimes called, and this being a time where the person's mind was not capable of knowing right from wrong, or that he or she was committing an illegal action. Now, the proof in these circumstances are often very lacking, and this could actually prove to be the downfall of the claim in general. It's actually incredibly difficult to prove this defense in the court of law, and in fact, it very rarely happens, despite what you may see depicted in TV shows and movies. Now, before I conclude this video, I would just like to restate for those who are unfamiliar with my videos. I do not condone the action discussed in this video or any of my videos. nor do I support any individual who would commit such acts. That is all I have time for you tonight, my lovelies, and I hope you enjoyed my fact and terms video. And as always, haunting dreams and blessed be.